My name is Kevin Strickland. I'm the Bishop of the Southeastern Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which encompasses Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Alabama. It is a pleasure to be with you this afternoon and hope you are all doing well. We are in a webinar form, so unfortunately you're not able to see one another, but you are able to see myself and our presenter for today. And we are glad you're here. We are committed to the work of racial justice, of diversity, of racial healing, of combating racism and calling it what it is, a sin. We do this not by ourselves, but we do this with one another. We do this because our baptism calls us to do this. We do this because our Lord evokes it in us, and the Holy Spirit guides us in the work. Today, we are privileged to hear from Dr. Catherine Meeks, and you will find in these 2 hours, I think that you will have the pleasure of sitting at the feet of a giant. And I have been privileged to have the opportunity to get to know Dr. Meeks briefly these past few months and look forward to more years of friendship as we continue to do the work of racial healing in this country and in our churches. Dr. Meeks is the executive director of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing. Prior to the center's opening, she chaired its precursor beloved community, the Commission for Dismantling Racism for the Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta. She is a sought-after teacher and author, a workshop leader. Dr. Meeks brings 4 decades of experience to the work of transforming and dismantling racism work, not only in Atlanta, but in the Episcopal Church, other denominations, in the wider community. The core of her work has been with people who have been marginalized because of economic status, race, gender, or physical ability, as they pursue liberation, justice, and access to resources that can help lead them to health, wellness, and more abundant life. This work grows out of her understanding of her call to the vocation of teacher, as well as her realization that all of humanity is one family which God desires to unite. You can hear more information about the Center for Racial Healing by going to the Absalom Jones Episcopal Center for Racial Healing, which is on Facebook, and their website is also up to date with many wonderful resources. Dr. Meeks, it is a pleasure to have you join us this day, to glean from you, to hear from you, but also to do this work together with you. When we last spoke, you made a comment that stuck with me. And you may not remember this, but I do. In addition to your fabulous glasses that you always wear, you also share with us little pearls. And one of the pearls you shared with me last time was you said that this is a work in progress, and it will be a work in progress until the work is no longer needed. I took away from that a sheer sense of responsibility, a sense of hope, but also a sense that we are all in this together. And that we are not, nor have we ever been, people who are alone in the work of God's divine plan of the beloved community. So I am so thrilled to welcome you into the space and in this time, and look forward to hearing from you this day. I'll begin with a prayer and then give a couple of instructions for our time together and see if Pastor Michael Jeanette has any techie things that we should know about. But I'll begin with a prayer. God be with you.
And also with you.
Our good and gracious God, you've called us to ventures of which we cannot see the ending, as paths yet untrodden through perils unknown. Give us faith, O God, to go out with good courage, to create good trouble, to be a part of the family that you have created in creation that values all people's dignity, all people's being, all people's color as beloved, as sacred, as beautiful, made in your divine image, no less and no more. Guide and direct our hearts, O God. Pour your Holy Spirit upon us that you drive us forth into this creation, being of good courage, to get into good trouble, to do the work of racial healing and racial justice and good boundaries. We give you thanks, O God, for this, your servant, Dr. Catherine Meeks, for all who strive for justice and equity and equality, and for all who tend to the community to make it more and more beloved in your sight. Open our hearts and minds this day, we pray, O God, that we may be transformed by this hearing to live and witness to all we come in contact with. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Pastor Jeanette, would you like to unmute yourself and give any tech responses to us?
I'll leave my video off, but just to let you know, if you have any issues, I put my email address in the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties, please send me an email and I'll respond right away. Otherwise, feel free to use the Q&A section. If you use the chat, just a reminder that that's coming just to the panelists, which is fine. Then we can take some of those if you want to do that more privately. But if you have a question you'd like to enter publicly, please enter it in the Q&A section.
Thank you. And Dr. Meeks and I have discussed, she'd like to present for, I think, the first hour you said, Dr. Meeks?
Yes.
And then take a brief break. When we come back from the break, then I can help moderate any sort of questions that may come in and take it from there.
Right. Great.
With all
Thank
that
you.
said, we welcome you, and I'm going to turn my video off so that you're the main person we get to see. But thank
right.
you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Bishop Strickland. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us this afternoon to engage in this time together. I'm delighted to be a part of it. And when I hear people saying things like Bishop Strickland said about me, I think I would be smart if I just would leave then before I ever opened my mouth, and maybe you could keep on believing all of that. But nevertheless, let me just say that I have 150% commitment to trying to be a well person and trying to discover what that means in terms of God's intention for me. And it's led me to do this work that I am doing. And I will continue to do it until the day I die, because it is not going to be finished anytime soon. I really appreciate what Bishop Strickland said in the beginning about this work being about our spiritual journey and our wellness and the sinfulness of racism, because I think that this work needs to be put under that umbrella quickly, and it needs to be a non-negotiable for us, people of faith. We want to sometimes play games with ourselves, and we talk about racial healing or racism or reconciliation, all in terms of social justice and liberation for people of color. And we get lost in thinking that it's got to do with some external things much more than the internal journey of being spiritually well. I know many folks who are white who don't believe that this work has got anything to do with them because they feel fairly progressive. They think we've made great strides, and why can't we just be okay and go on down the road together? Well, we can't, because we're not well, and because we are not living into the truth of the baptismal covenant to respect the dignity in everybody on this planet. As long as we have systems of oppression that denigrate and marginalize and ultimately cause people to lose their lives, we who believe in freedom and believe in wellness cannot rest. So I want to begin with a piece of poetry that I sent you, because I believe that poetry says more to us with fewer words than so much of the prose that we take in and struggle with. This poem comes from the wonderful Spanish poet Antonio Machado. So I'm going to read it and then just talk a little bit about that. And then I want to tell you a little bit about how I've come to do this work, take a look at the working glossary that I sent to you, and have some other comments about the spiritual formation nature of this work. And then we'll take a little break and come back and listen to a lovely spoken word piece by a young woman who works with me regarding her experience of being a Black person in America. By the way, before I say another word, I need to say all of us need to stop for a second and think about today is Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly known as Columbus Day. And I think that as we talk today, we certainly want to hold in our consciousness and in our hearts our Indigenous sisters and brothers and the ways in which we have treated them and the many sins that we have to atone for that behavior, and how all of us stand in complicity in those ways of denigrating, marginalizing, and pushing the Native people to the edges of the land and our consciousness, and how much God must be anxiously awaiting for us to start thinking about that and start rectifying that mistake. Last night while I was sleeping, I dreamed, blessed illusion, a fountain flowed inside my heart. Water, tell me by what hidden channel you came to me with a spring of new life I never drank. Last night, while I was sleeping, I dreamed, blessed illusion, I had a beehive inside my heart. And from my old bitterness, the gold bees were contriving white combs and sweet honey. Last night, while I was sleeping, I dreamed, blessed illusion, a fiery sun glowed inside my heart. It was fiery, giving off heat from a red fireplace. It was the sun throwing out light and made one weep. Last night, while I was sleeping, I dreamed, blessed illusion, that it was God I held inside my heart. Has my heart gone to sleep? Beehives in my dreams, have you stopped working? Is the water wheel of thought dry? Its buckets empty, spinning and filled with shadow? No, my heart's not asleep. It's awake, not sleep or dreaming. It looks with open, bright eyes at far signals and listens on the shores of a great silence. I think that all of us want to stand in kind of affirmation and confirmation that our hearts are not asleep. And even if we were beginning to doze a little bit, that these multiple pandemics that are confronting us at this present moment are calling us to awake the chaos that's been created by the pandemic of COVID-19 and the ongoing pandemic of racial woundedness and unrest. And now, of course, the raging, angry expression of the environment as it tries to deal with how we are not taking care of it. We find ourselves walking on this track where we just seem fraught by one thing after another all the time. I'm just struck by forest fires and floods and hurricanes and tornadoes. It almost sounds like we're reading something from the Old Testament when you just sit for a minute and assess where we are. I think that I see a great invitation that's being given to us right now, a great invitation to stop and pay attention and get on some new tracks and ask ourselves some new questions. I really, really and truly believe that most of our lives has to be centered around finding out what the essential questions are that we need to be dealing with in the period that we're living. And right now, we have to answer some essential questions ourselves. And one of them is, who do we want to be when this virus, the physical virus, has subsided, when we are no longer having to wear masks and social distance and be basically afraid to take a breath when we're in the presence of anybody else who might be speaking to us? Who do we want to be? And I know that as we started into this era of COVID-19, that there were some of us who thought if we just keep our heads down and just kind of hunker into the space and see if we can't just get past it, we'll do this and we'll get back to where we can be normal. I don't think we're going to be able to get back to, quote, normal. I think we're going to be continually asked to be new, to be transformed, to bring new energy, to bring new understandings, to bring new questions, to bring new courage to the work that's in front of us. Racism is a pandemic that has been with us since the first time Europeans set foot on the soil in this part of the world. I was just reading a quote this morning that Christopher Columbus made about the native people, about how giving they were and gracious and generous, and how easy it would be to make them slaves and to control them and to take everything from them. What an attitude to bring to a new world, and to have the audacity to talk about discovering it. He didn't discover it. He never understood who they were. None of them ever understood who they were. They were just pawns in a power game for them. These lovely people who had developed all different and wonderful ways of being together and living in community. And we have so much to learn from, even still, after we have done so much to destroy them. As I'm passing by this space about Indigenous people, let me encourage you to read Roxanne Ortiz's book, An Indigenous History, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. It's a very wonderful treatise on of our sisters and brothers who were here when living and knew where they were and did not need to be discovered. When Columbus and all of the others arrived, these folks were here in this region, not just the United States, but this whole region of this part of the world. So I think you would find an Indigenous people's history to be very encouraging and uplifting. It's very well written. It helps you to grieve about what we have lost because we have done what we did to Indigenous people. If our hearts are awake, then what does that mean for us who are people of faith? Where do we start and where do we stop and where do we come down in a place that says, this is where I'm grounded? I encounter so many people with questions such as, how do you get started? How do you work for racial healing, particularly as you work in congregations, sometimes with people who are not particularly clear about their woundedness in the first place, and then they're certainly not that interested in trying to think about what they need to do to get well. And are quick to be ready to relegate this work to social justice politics so that they don't have to deal with it because they somehow decided that social justice and politics didn't have anything to do with them unless it was when they wanted it to have something to do with them. So I don't know what all of your jobs are. It would be wonderful to be in the room with you and to hear more about who you are and what you do. But I know that you are leaders in the church, and that as leaders in the church, you are engaging people in congregations, and that many of the same questions and struggles and conflicts that are in one particular denomination spread across all of them. So I know in the Episcopal Church, we have a lot of, it's politics, it's social justice, it's this, it's that. And basically what folks are saying is, I don't want to be bothered. I think I figured this out. I want my life to just rock along. And our job as people of faith is to say, well, you need to stop for a minute and reflect upon the question of how can you be well if you are marginalizing people, if you're categorizing people, if you're thinking some people are better than other people, if you're supporting an indefensible system of white superiority and white supremacy, you cannot be a well person and have those attitudes. And if you want to be well, then maybe the next question is, what do I need to do? I've often said in many of the talks that I've been giving lately that my favorite piece of scripture is a story of Jesus at the pool of Bethsaida, when this gentleman who's crippled and been there for 30 years is lamenting to Jesus that he would want to get in the pool when the angel comes to stir up the waters and when healing is possible, but nobody will help him to get into the pool. And, and if somebody said that to me, or probably to you too, you would say, well, these people have been really thoughtless and they really should have considered that you're lying here on this and crippled, and they should have helped you by now. But instead of Jesus lamenting with him, Jesus said to him, do you want to be well? Do you want to be well? And so I'm asking myself that question, and I ask myself that question for the church, and I ask myself that question for the country. When I ask myself that question for myself, I know the answer is yes, I do want to be well. I will do whatever it takes in order to be a well person. When I ask myself that question in regards to the church, I'm hoping the answer is yes. And I know that many people are saying yes, but I'm working on being able to believe that the whole church would have a resounding yes to we want to be well in terms of racial healing. When I ask myself that question in terms of the country, I don't think the answer is yes. I think we are still more committed to the systems of oppression and the indefensible system of white supremacy and the notion of superiority of white skin. I think we're so committed to that, and we've constructed so many structures around that indefensible premise until we've got a long ways to go as a nation before we can make that an affirmative answer. However, I believe the church is always called to be on the side of being the chisel, with chisel and hammer, chiseling at the foundation of the things that need to be changed. And the people that are willing to have the mustard seed hope and faith that says we will keep on working at this and we will keep working to destabilize the system that keeps people from being who they were put on the earth to be. Yes, our hearts are awake. Yes, there are a bunch of bees in our hearts. There are beehives weaving new questions. And at least even if the questions aren't becoming really clear to us right now, the bees are weaving unrest, a lot of unrest, and we're having to navigate that unrest. And, you know, I'm like everybody else. I like for things to be regular and normal, and get up in the mornings and go through my little routines and not have too many situations that require me to be into drama. I don't like drama at all. I like a day to just kind of rock along and be good and have good engagements and great conversations and not be too stressful. Well, God doesn't confer with me about what the days are going to be like. The days are what they are. And the promise is that God will be present. God will be present every moment, every breath, every step of the way, no matter what the day is. And right now, for whatever reasons in the universe, we are in the middle of being turned upside down and inside out. And we have many ways that we can respond to that. We can try to hide under the bed or hold our heads down until we get past it, or we can step up to the plate and say, here am I, let me engage this. Let me see what the invitations are that I'm being given. So let me just tell you a few sentences here about why I have such a deep passion for this work. I grew up in Arkansas. My father was an illiterate sharecropper who died when I was age 16. My mother was a school teacher who worked 18 years at least, because all of my life, my mother was trying to get her college degree. She finally got her degree when I was 18 and when I graduated from high school. She didn't take that long to go to school because she was slow. She took that long because it was so difficult for a Black woman to get a degree in Arkansas at that time, because she had to work. My mother taught school. She taught school, and she also worked on the farm to help my father, who was sharecropping. And if you know anything about sharecropping, you know that it's just glorified slavery. So there was no way that sharecropping was ever going to be anything to help us get ahead in any kind of way. I grew up with the story of the death of my 12-year-old brother, who died because he couldn't get treatment in the white only medical facility that was a few miles from our house, and had to be sent to the charity hospital, which was over 70 miles from our house. And by the time my father could arrange to get him there, it was way too late, and my brother ended up dying. My father lived with post-traumatic stress from having lost a child, particularly a little child at 12, like that. not being able to take care of us and protect us. The main thing parents are supposed to be able to do for their children. My father was angry and sad and felt totally immobilized many times because of that. Died when he was 70 from a stroke. And it's no wonder he had a stroke, given the stress that he lived with all of his life. But I learned a lot of things from my father. One was to care about the nature and to care about the world outside, because even though he was a sharecropper, he would get up in the mornings and go walk the field to check out the crop and see what had happened in the evening and through the night. So he loved those plants and he loved the outdoors. And I learned that from him. My father used to let me sit on his lap and read to him, even though he could not read any of the words that I was reading. He supported me, and that sent me a message that it was okay to be a smart little girl. And also, I made a resolution somewhere deep down in my soul that I would not be held captive to whatever was holding my father captive, because my father was not the kind of person that I wanted to grow up to be like. I did not want to be sad and to feel the kind of lack of agency that I often felt my father had, because he did. An illiterate Black man in segregated Arkansas has no power, has no agency except what is internal. And he passed on some of that internal agency to me, and it helped me to be the kind to tap into my own warrior woman energy that led me toward the place of saying, I have to be well, and I will turn over every rock everywhere in order to find the pathway to wellness. So that's a very short kind of a introduction about why I do this work and why it's so important to me. And I think that each of you who sit now in this session need to go back into your own experiences and see what has brought you to the place of understanding this to be important work. How did you get here? And it has to be more than somebody said, that's what we're going to do. It can't be that the bishop says in this church, we're going to do this, and then people go do it. You have to find what is the energy system inside of yourself that propels you forward, that makes you do the interrogation that needs to be done of yourself to come to terms with what you think the work is for you and what you are willing to do in order to get it done. I think that there's some very essential questions that have to be asked. And the most essential question that I have come to realize is, what am I willing to give up in order to be well? What am I willing to give up in order to be well? What am I willing to sacrifice in order to be well? And I think part of the reason why we don't want to talk about racial healing and justice in the United States is because white people who have enjoyed the supremacy, the position, the benefits of supremacy are clear that something has to be given up, because you can't keep everything the same and have it change. In order for things to change, something has to be different. I don't think people have to give up what they think they have to give up. I think what they don't understand is that if you give up this attitude of holding on to these indefensible principles of supremacy, that it would be replaced with liberation, and the liberation would be a far better reward than the supremacy could ever bring. But it's difficult to get people to believe that when they've only enjoyed the benefits of what is the status quo. So what are you willing to give up first is the question. And then how can you get those who are in your care, under your tutelage, or that you get to preach to or interact with, to begin to embrace that same question for themselves. What am I willing to give up in order to be well? I suffer from a rheumatoid arthritis, and in order to be a halfway healthy person who gets to walk around and not have to be carried around in a wheelchair, there are things that I have to give up. I have to give up stress. I have to give up laziness and go to the gym. I have to give up certain kinds of foods that contribute to inflammation. And I'm clear about those things and willing to give them up in order to be well. So in order to create the world where there is the affirmation of every human being as being a beloved child of God, and everybody is here with the same rights to have access to the resources that can make them be able to live the life that God intended for them to live. Are we ready to have that world really? Or are we still into the space of, I worked really hard to get what I got and everybody else needs to work harder to get theirs? You know, what are you willing to give up? Attitudinally, what are you willing to give up? What are the places inside of ourselves that we're holding on to, what things that justifications for certain kinds of privileges that we hold, and thinking that we have those privileges because we paid for them in some kind of way. Those are all things that are flying around out in our universe, and they have to be engaged in order to really get onto the path of doing this work. And then what is non-negotiable for you? There are a couple of non-negotiables for me. One is that the idea that there is one God who has created everybody, and in God's love and appreciation, and God loves everybody in the same way. Now, if somebody wants to argue that there are some people who are more loved by God than others, then that may be a journey that you want to take up. I do believe that it's much more helpful to try to not understand God as being split up into a lot of pieces, making some people that are better than other people, so I can justify marginalizing people and even get around to justifying oppression. And if for some strange reason I'm mistaken about that, and that there's some other force that did manage to create some people that somehow don't seem to be the same as others, I'm sticking with that everybody deserves to have an opportunity to be who they were put on the earth to be. It is a better position to live in than to sit up thinking that there's some people who are better than other people, and thus it doesn't matter how we treat them. It matters how we treat people. It matters for the sake of my own soul, how I treat people and what I think of them. So you have to come to grips with where you are with that. And I think that people don't realize that. I think that people are kind of thinking, you know, you can kind of be over here and over there and up yonder somewhere with all of that. But sooner or later, you've got to interrogate your position about that. Are there many gods who created all kinds of different people, some more deserving than others, thus giving you the right to hold on to a little bit of, well, you know, they just aren't quite up to par, or they don't quite deserve this because they didn't quite work hard enough. And remember, Jesus anticipated some of this by telling us that parable about the workers that all showed up at different times of the day and ended up being paid the same. I think Jesus was trying to say something to us about being careful how we think about people, and how we think about fairness, and how we think about looking at folks, and how we make judgments. And so there's enough stuff in the New Testament to really create a lot of necessity to come to terms with this in terms of how you see human beings and what you think of human beings in general. And then you can move on to, okay, now that I have decided, I've come to get this question answered for myself, and I'm settled with that. Now what? What do I do with that? So that I best be careful every time I walk out the door, how I deal with the folks that I encounter, because I am dealing with a person who's made in the image of God and who's loved by God equally as God loves me, and God has some expectations for me to greet that person in some ways and treat that person and see that person as a worthy, beloved child of God. When we come to that conclusion, when we come to that realization, when that becomes a non-negotiable for us, we begin to act differently toward people. We will have allowed the bees in the beehives in our hearts to weave a new understanding for us, to weave a new way to see the world. And there are these, you know, this might sound like an oversimplification. It might sound like it's, you know, it may even sound too hard to do. I don't really know. When we get later on to engage with one another, you can ask me some questions about this or make some comments. But I believe that when we get this kind of basic thing in place, then it begins to generate an energy system that informs our way forward in ways that would not happen if we hadn't done that work. I often have people ask me, how do you maintain the energy to keep doing the work? You know, how do you keep on being a resistor to racism, because it's tiring, and it is tiring. I'm 74 years old. I started doing this work when I was a kid in college in my 20s. So really here I am 50 years later, still talking about racial healing. Thought we'd be done with this by now, thought we'd be a liberated country and we'd all be trying to treat everybody right. Don't know why I thought that, but I did. And now I come to realize that that was just a thought that that deserved to die, really, because it's so far removed from reality. We are not that people. We are people who still trying to disenfranchise one another. We are that people who are here in the 21st century fighting about trying to keep some people from voting, you know, trying to mess up voting, trying to deny people their democratic freedoms. We're that people. We are that people. We are that people who up little children in cages last year, who, because they're little brown children, we are that people. And I have to let my life and my commitment to the journey reflect that reality, which means then being open to this new energy that's generated from coming to the realization that none of those people deserve to be treated that way, and that my job as a person of faith is to always be standing in against that, to be resisting that. And how do you do that? Over and over, year after year, and maintain it and not drive yourself crazy. And you do it by becoming a person who at the core of yourself is committed to the understanding that God did not create second-class people, or second standard people, or second tier people, that there is one group of people on this earth, and they're all beloved children of God. Now, some of them do make you want to give them a one-way trip into space. I get that. You know, all of us have probably got our list of folks that we could put on our own little spaceship and send out into space, never to be returned. But even with that feeling, which does come, I understand, we have to come to grips with, but those are still God's beloved children. And God expects me to open myself to God's energy and love so that I can shift a gear, so that I can be who God wants me to be, which is a person with an open heart. My wonderful mentor, Howard Thurman, who I always say, I never do any workshop without talking about Howard Thurman, because Howard Thurman's one of the most important mentors that I have had. And if you don't know him, I want to encourage you to Google him when this is over. I want to encourage you to go to YouTube and listen to him a little bit, and then make up your mind about whether you think he's somebody that you might want to engage if you don't know him already. If you do know him already, let me just encourage you to continue to be nourished and nurtured by him. But Howard Thurman says that the only place we can truly find refuge is in another person's heart. And it's important for us to keep our heart a swinging door. So if I keep my heart a swinging door when it comes to race, then as I encounter white people, Black people, whatever kind of people, I can be open to them. And I don't have to have a whole bunch of barriers and preconceptions and projections that keep me from being open. And if somebody passes by my heart and I realize that person's a danger to me because they would want to harm me or they want to hate me, then it's my job to figure out what is the way I need to be responding. And I should be always praying that God will help me to never respond with hatred, to never allow anybody to cause me to get down to that level of hatred. because if I hate them, I hurt myself far more than anybody else. And they won't ever even know the difference, actually, but they will have been successful in tying me up and tying up my energy and causing me to not be as well as I could be. So getting well, racial healing, dealing with racism is a two or maybe threefold piece of work. It is about being well ourselves. It is about working to be open to allow God's light to shine in all of the parts of us that we have shut off from other parts of ourselves, so that we can be open to the possibility of engaging the other outside of ourselves. It is about being willing to allow God's love and light to shine wherever God chooses to shine it, and to follow that love and light without hesitation, without trying to edit it, without any kinds of things except saying, here am I, send me. Here am I, send me. So it's non-negotiable that God has made us all. God loves us all. It's non-negotiable that we have been told to respect the dignity in every human being and to seek peace and justice on the earth. And we have assented to that in our baptismal covenant. We have said, yes, we will do that. We will live our lives that way to the best of our ability. And God is always willing to meet us in that space. It is difficult to stay faithful, period. In just about everything, it's difficult to stay faithful. It is difficult not to be dragged down the road of rage and hatred, particularly in the present moment of divisiveness and chaoticness. But it's also a challenge to say, God, help me to get out of this hurricane. Help me to find the core. Help me to get to the eye of the hurricane so I can sit and be still with you and hear what I need to be doing and find my way forward to do it, so that I'm not just swirling around like a piece of tumbleweed in a storm, but that I'm sitting at the core, seated with you, and you are telling me what the way forward happens to be, how I'm to get out of this center, this eye of the hurricane, back into the world without being blown away by the hurricane as it's swirling all around me. It's a pretty powerful image these days to think about, because all of these things that are happening, I don't know about all of you, but they do make me feel like, everything's gone just crazy. But then do I want to go crazy with it, or am I going to go and try to sit and find the space where I can hear how to enter again into the work? How do I stay faithful to this call without being embittered, without being taken away by rage or complacency or just flat out fatigue and weariness? Those are all issues that we have to confront as we are trying to live this faithful life. And the basic answer always comes back to coming back to the core and standing in God's light and asking to be re-energized by the things that we know that we need to be doing, and to make sure that we're doing what we're called to do and not trying to do what our grandmothers were called, or our uncle, or the bishop, or somebody. What are we called to do? When we find out the answer to that question, we also access the energy that we need to just consistently stay on the path to answering that call. So I just want to use these words as kind of a way to frame everything else that I would say on this day. We have 2 hours together, so it seems important to me to try to be a bit inspiring and affirming, and to encourage you, because I know that you're not just starting to think about this. I know that you have been thinking about this work and thinking about these issues that face us. And so I want to say thank you for doing that. Thank you for being there. I think it's so important for us to see ourselves as a part of a community of people that are willing to be in this struggle together, and that some of us are maybe further down the road than others. But even if that's the case, then our responsibility is to always be willing to reach out a hand to the person behind us to help them know that they're not walking in the darkness by themselves. So I want to acknowledge that you are on the journey, and this conversation today is just about how to be a bit more encouraged and have a few more tools for going forward. And speaking of tools, I would like to spend a little time now paying attention to the glossary that I sent to you, because I do believe that in trying to talk about the issues of race, that oftentimes it's difficult sometimes. The language is difficult because somebody will be talking about prejudice, but they're thinking racism, and somebody else is talking about white privilege, and the person is thinking, I don't have any, because they don't understand what you really are talking about. So I think it's important to be able to kind of be on the same page when we're using words that can help us to communicate better, because part of the biggest problem we have around all of the work with dealing with race is that we miscommunicate, and we say two people are talking, but they mean two different sets of things about, I mean, you know, they're passing by one another. And I'm not going to go through the in real fine tuning of all of these words, because you can actually read them yourself and think about them yourself. But I do want to talk about the prejudice and racism, internalized depression, and white privilege, because those are the words that I have found over all these years of doing workshops that seem to carry the most misunderstanding and make it the hardest for people to actually talk together about. So when people talk about prejudice, you know, every single solitary person on the earth has got some prejudice about something, because prejudice means you made up your mind about something without having all the information, and that you decided you have an opinion. Of the example that we use in the glossary is, if somebody says they don't like tomatoes but they never ate one, they just looked at them and decided they didn't like them. So then you made up your mind without all the information, because you made up your mind on the basis of how the tomato looked, how it felt, maybe even how it smelled, but you didn't bother to taste it. And there's no way you can know if you like it unless you taste it. So when we think about that, all of us have got some of those things we've kind of carried around with us. We learned as a little kid. I used to think my mother was trying to poison us when she would cook certain kinds of vegetables like squash or some blackberries, because I hated blackberry seeds. And now I don't mind blackberry seeds, and I don't mind squash. As a matter of fact, I love squash, because when I actually finally tasted it, I discovered it was a pretty good meal, actually. So to use prejudice and racism interchangeably is a huge mistake, because racism then is a combination of prejudice that has been systematized and empowered and can actually be used to hurt somebody, which it often is doing. So in order to have a whole system based upon race that excludes another group of people, there's got to be a whole lot of power invested in that. And there are no systems that exist right now in the United States that are poised toward helping Black and brown people, but totally disenfranchise white people. Oh, I know there's some folks who think that affirmative action is such a system, but that's because they misunderstand what that was about. They misunderstand the reality, that the issue that affirmative action was even trying to deal with. But to understand that there are systems, that all of the basic systems in the United States are were set up with the notion of making things better for white people, and sometimes very clearly excluding Black people and brown people and Native people, actually. Anybody who was not white was excluded. One of the things that comes to mind is something like Social Security that was set up so that the people who did agricultural work and domestic work could not receive Social Security benefits. And at the time when Social Security was put into effect, Black people were the people who were doing that work. So instead of having the courage to say, we're not going to give Social Security to Black people, it just said if you're an agricultural worker or a domestic worker, you couldn't get Social Security benefits. Well, how interesting to be able to get away with using that kind of coding to exclude a whole group of people. There's a difference between just being prejudiced towards somebody Black and then setting up a whole system that excludes them, especially excludes them from benefits that could have helped their lives to be better. So you can see how the ways in which prejudice then becomes a systematic thing that is designed to create a certain purpose, and that it's a whole different thing from just being somebody sitting in your house disliking somebody because they don't look like you, or they don't talk like you, or whatever. You can sit in your house and dislike them all you want to, but it doesn't hurt them. But if you develop a whole system that excludes them, it's a completely different thing. So when people use, when people say, the Black folks were racist, they're mistaken, because the Black folks don't have any systems that exclude you or any other whole group of people, because we don't have that kind of power. Our power hasn't been put out that way. Oh yeah, there's some clubs and stuff, fraternities maybe you could be excluded from, but that's not exactly the same thing. And when white people get into trying to make them the same thing, they're basically just trying to keep from dealing with the bigger issue, which is that across the United States, there's systematic exclusion of Black and brown people. Is not the same that you can't join 100 Black men. I mean, okay, so you can't join, this isn't really true. I think you can join if you want to, but if you're a white person and you can't join 100 Black men, how is that the same as you can't get a loan from the bank, you can't live in certain neighborhoods, you can't get Social Security, you can't get a fair shake in the courts? Those things don't come up to the same level for comparison. And when people start playing that game, it is a game they're playing, and it's a game they're playing with themselves to keep from engaging the real issue, which is the issue of exclusion based upon skin color. The other one is white skin privilege. Over and over and over, I've encountered white people who say, I have no privilege because we were poor growing up, and we just had to work really hard and never got anything much for the hard work. Well, it doesn't matter how poor you were. It doesn't matter how hard you worked. In the United States of America, if your skin is white, you're considered to be a superior person to a Black person or a brown person or a Native person, period. So you can be poor as anybody who comes from any region where there's a lot of lack, because this whole thing was never about economics anyway. The privilege business was not about economics only. It was about your skin is white, that gives you an advantage. And then of course, if you were rich and white, you had some more advantages, but you could be poor and white and you still had better advantages than somebody who was Black and not poor, actually, because of the way we constructed things. So this conversation is just about, let's tell the truth. Let's tell the truth, and let's not try to cover it up. And then once we tell that truth, we can decide where we go from there. Internalized depression is the other piece of this that I think is so important to think about. In the process of trying to justify racism, a lot of projection was done particularly onto Black people and probably the Native people too. And then I think later on to other groups that were brought here or came to the US and got included in this whole milieu of oppression. But the notion of kind of who Black people are, that there's still so much negative stuff that's been put out into the universe by white people about who Black people are, the stories that are made up. I mean, I was just so dumbfounded that when the Obamas were in power, that people would want to start trying to equate them with monkeys. You know, that was so disheartening to me. But it says something about the deep angst in the white psyche about who Black folks are. And I tell you, I have to confess, I want to understand that so much better, because it just is mind-boggling to me to think about, you know, what is that about that you have this, you have to go to that level in the 20th century, even in trying to think about folks that we have been living around and with for 400 years, and you still want to go back to, well, you are more close to the apes than we are. I don't think so. I don't think so. And so I think we're all part of that evolutionary process as human beings, and we to go trying to use that any of those evolutionary things as a negative to justify denigration and genocide and all the things we practiced is really a statement about the person who's trying to do that, much more than it is about the people to whom they're trying to do it. But unfortunately, people who are oppressed ended up taking in some of those stories and some of that narrative and making it their own, which is what we talk about when we're talking about internalizing it. And if somebody is, you know, historically denigrating you and putting you on the margin and leaving you out and then telling you the reason why they're doing it is because you're not as good as them or whoever, it's difficult not to start believing it. It's difficult not to be impacted by that. And even though I have to say quickly, as we pass by this whole piece, that I am so amazed at the fact that so many people who were slaves were able to become transcendent of that message and find another way to be in the world. I mean, it's a phenomenal thing to think about. It's also phenomenal to think about how much people wanted to hold on to that way of denigrating Black folks and naming them as something or another to try to justify racism and not being willing to see them as kindred spirits. So we who are people of color have to work on extricating ourselves from the oppression construct, from the oppression that we've internalized, from the ways in which we have allowed that narrative of substandard to be pushed onto us, both concretely and subtly, and how that's affected the ways in which we operate with each other. There are many things that we get into talking about that have to do with the ways in which people who are oppressed deal with each other. That is an example of their internalization of oppression. So that's an important thing for white people who want to work with people of color to be clear about, and also to constantly be interrogating yourself to make sure you're not continuously contributing to that. The other day I did a little talk about my book, Passionate for Justice. Ida B. Wells is a prophet for our time. I recommend it to you. It's quite a wonderful story about Ida B. Wells, who's just an amazing soul. And someone was talking about the power of African-American women. Well, some of that is a projection. You know, African-American women, yes, we can be warrior women. We have had to be warrior women. We had to stand up and run interference for our families, because the men in our lives were not allowed to be strong. They were killed right off, and they took a while to kill us. And so we had to try to navigate all of that. But that is not the essence of who we are. We're just human beings like everybody else, with foibles like everybody else. And we have a warrior woman side, and we have the side that wants to be taken care of and wants to not have to be a warrior woman as well. And so it's important for us, the Black woman, not to just fall into the trap of, oh yes, I'm a warrior woman, let me just go keep on being that all the time and kill myself to prove that this projection is right. Rather to say, well, that's a part of who I am, but it's not all of who I am. So then you start turning that projection back onto the one who's making the projection, so that you can set yourself free. You can define yourself. You can have something to say about who you're going to be in the world. So internalized depression is a thing that has to be worked on. And white skin privilege, it should be white supremacy / white skin privilege, is a thing that white people have to work on. People of color have to work on the internalization of oppression in order for all of us to move toward getting well. Implicit bias is listed here in this glossary because folks kept asking us to talk about that. Implicit bias is just a nice way to talk about all the other things that I've just been talking about. It's a bit of a nicer way to try to name people stepping out into the world, practicing a way of being that's reflective of either white supremacy or internalized oppression, of racism or prejudice. And we just have some particular ways to describe it in terms of talking about it as bias. But bias is deeply grounded in a system of some sort, even if people don't quite understand what that system happens to be. I realize it's 2:00 and I want to take a little break here to let you take a little break to go to the bathroom, get a drink of water. If you could come back in about 10 minutes, if you please be back promptly. And then we will watch this lovely spoken word piece that I would like you to have as a part of your consciousness as you leave this afternoon. And then we'll spend some time talking together, because I've been talking a way long time, and it's real important, I think, I want to hear what you all are thinking.
Thank you, Dr. Meeks, for the incredible hour with you. Friends, we'll take a brief break and come back. Please write your questions in the Q&A box. And Dr. Meeks, while folks are on break, we had a question about your glossary, and it doesn't seem to be complete, and number 4 ends with a continuation. So maybe we could get that resent to Pastor Michael. And
okay. Well, I'll just resend it when we finish, and she can send it out again to people. I don't know what happened. It was supposed to be complete, and I'll just send it again.
We'll get it fixed and send it out by email to everybody. But take a quick break, and you said come back at what time?
At 10 after 2.
Okay, perfect.
It's a 8 minutes now.
All right, this is Pastor Michael. Hope everybody's had a chance to get a break, and we're happy to let Bishop Strickland maybe share some of the questions that are in the Q&A, or if any other comments from Dr. Meeks, we'd be happy to continue. Thank you all.
So if you can do the spoken word piece now.
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you.
My name is stereotype. Judged and justified by the color of my skin, I secretly wonder if we can ever be friends. I'm the shade of black and brown. I represent legal systems that are sought to keep us bound. Biases, they plaster me with their colors. Are you redlining the color of my skin, making access harder because I have to fight systems from within? Housing, education, criminal justice, just to name a few. Unconscious bias shapes the world and systems around you. Same offense, different life sentence. The criminal charge was being black from the start. Sentenced to black maternity health care issues, because the real issue was the color of my black skin. Now, I'll admit, Sometimes I feel like 1/3 of property, returning us back to our ugly historical ancestry. And I want to cry from within. Can you hear my pain? This pain. It leaves me numb like Novocaine. Knick-knack, paddywhack, give a dog a bone, because I'm constantly reminded that we have greater regard for a dog's life than my own. Melanin, the color of my skin, and all that comes with it. Microaggressions, painful connections, pressure to be something I am not. White America, pain of my ancestors, and the lineage of inequality continues. Housing inequality, Eurocentric curriculums that says to me that my Black history is an elective and is optional, just like I am. Eurocentric curriculums shaping young minds to perceive one side of the story, never telling them that we are all worthy, and that's privilege. All kind of taglines, assumptions, and guidelines to make me acceptable. Targeted by the police, trying to prove that I too am worthy of release, because he suspected that something about me looked suspicious. Racial profiling, never considering that I am falling, and I have a panic attack on the spot. How did you afford that car, he asks. Where are you going? Where are you coming from? Why are you in this neighborhood? This is a nice car. Are you sure this car wasn't stolen? Give me your license and registration now. Then I'm reminded that I don't have a license to be here. His gun is so close to his hip and even closer to my heart. So yes, I'll confess, I was antagonized by the suspicion in his eyes from the start. I held my breath, praying to survive this encounter. This is the story of so many I know. Stopped while Black, breathing while Black, driving while Black, eating while Black. I'm constantly reminded until my veins crystallize blue because I can't breathe. So no, I don't have the luxury to go about my day in silence. Not speaking up may cost me my very liveliness. And it's the small things, like the fear of going to my white friend's home because I was told that her father hates Black people and that because of his biases, we could never get along. But I'll tell you in nicer words, you see, to attempt to preserve parts of my own humanity, because he couldn't see me as human. He saw my Black skin as a threat to human society. He saw me animalistic, and he felt it was his job to hold people that looked like me in captivity. I heard what my friend said, but I figured that I'd go to her house instead. Hiding and not free, I wanted to call my mom to get me. Constantly on my mind, I had to keep looking over my shoulders to assure I'd be fine. Fine for this Black skin I was born in. I've had several experiences like these. If not managed, that paranoia can bring a person to their knees. Constantly looking over my shoulders, holding my purse far out so they don't think I stole it. Having to look them in the eyes, hoping they'll remember that I too deserve to survive. When driving through certain towns, I will admit I take the long way. I know better than to drive through certain towns. I seek to save my life, so I take the extra time to avoid the rounds of bullets to the heart and possibly to my skin. Because the person who stopped me failed to realize and see that I too have a soul within. 911, what's your emergency? The emergency is me, cold-blooded killer, no technology this time to affirm me. So my blood screams out from the ground, seeking for someone to name the ugly truth so that we may begin to reclaim our grounds. And in your line of questioning, don't forget to question what culture has taught you about me. No, I don't care for rap music. I prefer country and R&B. Can you stop for a minute and not judge me? Watermelons, cotton picking, and no, I'm not a great dancer, but I dance anyway to remind myself that I am freer than any of my ancestors. No equal representation, code switching for protection, perceived as a threat, trying not to regret this black skin I was born in. Guilty until proven innocent. The law has been reversed, and it also reversed my innocence. I had a fear of being judged, so I lived my life in tension. Finally realizing that I can never convince someone else of my own significance. Made in the image of God, I am not inherently more dangerous. I am not more violent. You don't have to be fearful of me. I am not an animal. I did not come from a monkey, and no, I cannot wash my black skin off. Surprised I can speak with the eloquence you see? These are just some of the things that plague me. Worried for my brother, crying for my mother, missing my father as well. If you haven't gotten the picture at this point, it's all from a hateful, wicked, white supremacist system. Can't you tell? Amnesia. Why don't you remember? You don't see the daily effects of how this traumatizes me or my family members. Look closer. Don't you see that modern day excuse for captivity? I long to be heard, but I'm told to be silent. After all, I'm better off than they were. PTSD, post-traumatic slave disorder, and I fight it every day. I fight the internalized oppression that tells me to just throw up my hands, give up, and walk away. PTSD. Even science shows I remember my ancestors' trauma in my body's cells, that they are in prison cells. The criminal justice system is going to hell, and I fight the thought that things will always be this way. Like Rosa Parks, we've parked in our comfort. We sit on different parts of the bus. We live in two different realities. When we stand up, they hang us. Hang us with their foot on our necks. Get your foot off of my neck. A modern day lynching, a reminder to subject. Gasping for air. When will we realize that this is not an exaggeration? It's an egregious reality for those in countless locations of this great USA. The new Jim Crow internalized oppression. I'm constantly reminded that many will never view my black life as a blessing. Land of the free, home of the brave. But when I choose to speak up, they tell me to sit down, shut up, and behave. It's better than the massa, though. He beat me with a sword of rings and a lynching rope. But is this emotional pain still worthy to be healed? Are the wicked systems that kill still worthy to be revealed? Torn down, like my soul? No Negroes, dogs, or Jews allowed. But when a black man is beat down, dogs get better treatment than he does somehow. We justify it. We call out his criminal record from a rigged system that prepared him for this. Anger is raging, hatred is taking, no Negroes, dogs, or Jews allowed. That same history still separates us now. You see, telling my story does not victimize me. It is, in fact, the only way that we can start to really be free. Fear and assumptions keep us apart, but now there's a clarion divine call to reset and restart. This will only happen through relationships. They serve as a mirror for our biases and flaws. Together, we can tear down this wicked system of white supremacy that oppresses us all. Hello, my name is Unity. We don't all have to be the same to be free. Your color can benefit my color so that all colors can be free. And your privilege does not have to be used to weaponize me. Meaning well is not enough. Systemic changes will forever change the trajectory of black births. You don't have to feel guilt or shame. Instead, use your privilege to ensure that my life and the life of my ancestors will not be in vain. Stereotypes annihilate unity. Are you understanding that you have a choice into whom you will be, how you will respond, what you will do, if you will allow fear and silence as complicity to paralyze you? So I ask you again, what is your name? Remember, we all stand on the backs of someone's shoulders. Just make sure you're not standing on our neck.
I love that piece that Dominique does, and I want to invite all of you to go to the center's YouTube page where you can find it, and you can use it in any way you choose, or you can use anything that you find at our website as you go through your planning and teaching. And I think that this spoken word piece comes up so much, the journey. And it's a great, could be a great catalyst for conversation. So that's why I thought it would be a great idea to share it with you and to just to invite you to go and look at it and use it in any ways that you might be able to do so. It's about 13 minutes long. So, you know, you could even if you were doing a meeting for a 45 minutes, you could actually use that piece and then have some conversation. And I'm always interested in trying to give people practical, concrete things that you can do after conversations like this, because it can be frustrating just to get all inspired and then have well, where do I go now? So that's one place you can go, to our website, and anything you find there, please use it as you can and will. So what I'd like to do now, Bishop Strickland, is entertain people's questions and comments for a bit, because we always run out of time doing that. And I wanted to try to leave enough time so we can maybe get to whatever people would like to ask.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meeks. And what a powerful spoken word poem that was. The first question we have, and you addressed some of this earlier, but maybe you can speak a bit more to this even in your own personal life. But the first question is, how do you give up stress?
Oh, goodness. Well, that's a tough question. I think, a lot of it is about intentionality. We have to begin to become intentional about how much are we going to be traumatized by the events of the day, because that's really what makes us stressed out. And I'm pretty good at thinking that it's important to separate out what are the things you can actually do something about, and what are the things that you can't do anything about, and what is this really a disaster or is it an inconvenience? Trying to figure out things like that. I mean, that to me begins to help me get myself back in place, to kind of reconnect myself. So if I walk out of my house on my way to a meeting and I have a flat tire, that is inconvenient, but it's not a disaster. I didn't have a wreck. I'm not dead. Nobody died. I'm just inconvenienced. The worst thing that could happen is I might have to change my meeting. But I do have a telephone, so I don't have to send a pigeon to, inform people that I can't be there. I think that we have to kind of always be willing not to take ourselves too seriously. That helps with stress, because we thought, everything's supposed to go this way and it's going all other different kinds of ways and I can't navigate it. Well, maybe you're being asked to turn a corner, to do something different. Maybe God's plan is actually a better plan. And if you can stop and take that in, you remember the old guy, Brother Lawrence, that wrote way back, in the 8th, 9th century or something. He worked in the kitchen and he did all the cleaning of pots and cooking and stuff. And he said that he would get interrupted and he was aggravated that people were interrupting him when he's trying to do his work. He finally came to understand that the interruptions were his work. And so I think that refocusing our own lens helps us a lot with dealing with stress, because basically stress is caused because we had a plan that got foiled. Well, we wake up every day with a plan, and then there's God's plan. And some of those things that look like inconveniences, and sometimes even harder than inconveniences, really are disasters, but it's God's plan that's being worked out, and us being called to something different. We have to be willing to be in that conversation. And to the extent that I'm willing to be in the conversation, it reduces my stress level. You know, I'm not nearly as rigid. When I was 40, I was always worried and stressed out. I'm 74, and I'm so much less worried and stressed out because, you know, it's a day I haven't seen before, and I don't know what God's gonna do today. I know there are a few things I'm supposed to do, and I'll show up and do the best I can. But if I can't show up, then I won't show up. And at the end of the day, nobody will be dead because I didn't show up. That's the other piece. And so so all of what I've just said is really about attitude.
Yeah.
It's really about attitude. What attitude am I taking out into the day about everything? And it doesn't mean you don't care, that you're not organized, that you don't have a plan. None of those things get to go away. They are there, and you need to have a plan, but you need to hold it loosely because God's plan supersedes your plan. And actually, one of my poet friends says, you know, the plan you made was yesterday. You were planning yesterday for today. But when you get to today, yesterday's energy is no good anymore. So you don't know what today might be demanding. And so we should always plan very gingerly. We should hold our plans very gingerly, and then it's easier to let it go.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the pastor who asked that intended that to be helpful information that you just gave for me as the bishop to hear, but I received that response as a helpful response for my ears to hear. So thank you. And to add to that, a wise mentor of mine once said, "You never know what burdens another soul is carrying."
Right, that's right.
So when they interrupt our work and they become work, it may feel as if it's adding another level of stress to us, but that might be the most important conversation we have that day.
That's right. That's exactly right. And to have that attitude of being hospitable toward so-called interruptions and inconveniences, to be hospitable toward them is kind of a, well, let's see what, you know, at the end of the day, you can walk back through and think how many of those things really turned out to be quite uplifting and enlivening, even though they were unplanned and felt very serendipitous or aggravating or whatever, but they still had the same effect of bringing us something that we didn't know we were going to get that day as well.
Another person has asked this question. One pastor writes, as rostered leaders, which the ELCA, it's what we call pastors and deacons, how do we speak to our congregations of white privilege and supremacy when our earnings, pension, and medical benefits are dependent upon those we wish to identify our non-negotiables? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I get that question. The question is, how do you tell the truth to people who don't want to hear it when they have effect upon your livelihood? And so one of the things that I have found helpful is to have a clear sense inside myself of what I'm willing to pay for whatever action I'm engaging in. So if I'm willing to lose my job, you know, when we were in college, we were so funny. We were always ready to lose our scholarships because we figured that was the one thing the administration could do to us. If we wanted to be activists, they could take our scholarships. They could have also kicked us out of school, but that didn't ever seem to bother us. We were more worried about our scholarships because if they took the scholarship, we were going to have to leave school anyway. And so once you decided that, okay, if I lose my scholarship, I can live with it, I'll do the best I can, then everything else doesn't matter. So I think that every person has to decide, what am I willing, as I said earlier, am I willing to pay? What am I willing to give up for the ways in which I'm choosing to live in the world? And I'm not going to suggest that anybody should stand up on Sunday morning and deliberately try to lose your job by saying stuff to your congregation. That would really be a very strange way to be in the world. But I do think that you have to make some decisions along the way about how much of your integrity can be compromised in order to stay safe.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you want to compromise your integrity in order to stay safe? Is that really the price you want to pay for ultimately having the passion and the whatever? Or is it another way to be in the world? And that's a very personal kind of thing that everybody has got to come to grips with themselves. I grew up picking cotton, chopping cotton, and helping white women in their kitchens. And I always thought that if I had done that work, there wasn't any other work off limits to me, as long as it was not illegal. So, and I was a college professor saying to myself, I could go pick cotton if I have to, I can wait on tables, but this is who I'm going to be. Yeah. And I did okay. You know, oh no, I missed out on a few promotions and pats on the back and accolades by standing with the marginalized and fighting for people, fighting causes that some folks thought I shouldn't be fighting. But I did not lose out on myself. I did not lose out on coming out of 35 years of being in higher education, feeling like I was true to who I was put on the earth to be. So you have to spend a lot of time with yourself, clarifying what it takes for you to be who you want to be. And who you feel God is calling you to be. And if being a pastor keeps you from being who God called you to be, you have got to really work with that and see what then is being a pastor about. If you think that God called you to be that, then you've just got to be that. And Simone Weil says that it's our job to be obedient to God. It's God's job to take care of us. And maybe not in the way I thought, you know, maybe something changes. Maybe I get, you know, I go down a different road from what I was thinking, but always coming back to what is it that is required of me to be the person I was put on the earth to be, and to be able to answer that for yourself. Nobody can answer it for you, and nobody can be critical of your answer because it's your answer. But we must always be encouraging each other to keep asking ourselves the question.
That's really helpful. Thank you. The next couple of questions are similar in nature. This next pastor says, Dr. Meeks, as a white pastor, when I advocate for the Black Lives Matter movement, along with all other movements that lift up the lives of persons of color, I am sometimes met with the response, well, Pastor, all lives matter. I responded with the Sermon on the Mount until all individual subsets of the human community who were heretofore marginalized were told that they too were empowered by God, then the people of that time would never know what it means to be one community of believers. In other words, the whole is not complete until all the parts are recognized. Does that response work for you, this pastor asked?
Well, you know, I'm not a pastor, so I don't have the same kind of constraints that you are describing. I do believe that when people want to say all lives matter, they just want to skip over the conversation. They want to skip over because if you are really honest with yourself, you know good and well all lives don't matter equally in the United States. You know that, if you're really honest with yourself. And so I think that, but I think it is a good strategy to go to Jesus to respond, though, because people do need to start engaging with the notion, or are they really going to try to follow Jesus, or they're just going to make up some stuff along the way. And Jesus really was there to say, everybody, you know, there's one Father, and that Father is in charge of us and made us. And so I think that is a good place to go to the scripture. But I do believe that folks have to keep on being challenged to understand that if all lives mattered, you know, then where are the indigenous people in our daily circle? Why don't we see them in the grocery stores and in our just traveling around? Why aren't they living among us if all lives matter? You know, people get so worried about Black lives a lot because of all that historical angst we've got about Black skin. But what about Native people? We're all living on their land, all of us. And where are they? You've got to drive a long time to find anybody who's an indigenous person. So I would add them into the conversation when people start talking about all lives matter. Just ask them, you know, when was the last time you saw a Native person? Wonder how do their lives matter? You know, because sometimes people need to be challenged to stop and think about what they're really saying, because they haven't. They're just saying stuff to try to get themselves to some place that feels balanced. But if you can get folks to stop and really think about what they're saying, sometimes you can get a deeper conversation. And I wish you the best with that. That's hard because people don't like to have to deal with the truth of who we are and what we've done.
And that truth is often close to home.
Yes.
It's around our Thanksgiving tables, or it gives us birthday cards, or they're a family who we're friends with on Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I posted a picture of me wearing a Black Lives Matter mask, and within 10, 15 minutes, people came out of the woodwork just railing against it. And people I haven't talked to in 20 years, some family, you know, about, well, as a bishop of the church, how could I possibly say that all lives don't matter? So you know, it was interesting, that same question this pastor just asked, you know, I got publicly asked basically.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, part of what I took from that, Dr. Meeks, was unless your privilege has never been challenged, when it starts to be challenged, then you become more uncomfortable than you ever have. And then you start to get just a small taste, I think, of most people of color in this United States feel every single day of their life.
Absolutely. And you don't say that other lives don't matter just because you said Black lives matter.
Exactly.
I mean, I don't understand that. Like, okay, so if I advocate for my sons, it doesn't mean that I don't care about girls.
Exactly.
It just means I'm advocating right now for this group of people. So to jump to the conclusion that I've got to declare that all lives matter just because somebody said Black lives matter is a good thing to interrogate yourself about. Why you're even being reactionary.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. The next pastor says, again, same vein, how do we as the beloved community begin to heal the racial boundaries in congregations while dealing with the systemic racism within our own systems?
You know, yeah, that's a big challenge, but I think you have to just start with, you start every day. You start with storytelling, you start with doing whatever you're gonna do to help people be awake in your particular congregation. And you take people where they can go. You know, some people have got to work on their own personal brokenness before they can even begin to think about anything systemic, because they just can't go that far. So I think that you go in fear and trembling, you go in humility, and you go with every confidence, and you go unapologetically toward leading people to greater personal consciousness, and then helping them understand how that's got to be externalized into the larger world. And you have to go with the people you've got. You can't go with folks you wish you had. You know, and you can't even go sometimes as far as you could go yourself, because you may be way ahead of where the folks are. So if people got to take these little half a baby step, though it's aggravating and frustrating, you just got to do that. So you got to start where you can start and go where you can go. And it doesn't matter that your fellow pastor his group might be going, or her group might be going way faster and way down the road. That's all well and good. You got your people, and you have to go the way you can go. And so I want to encourage stepping in wherever you can step in, and going at whatever pace you can go. But it does always need to be that, you know, this is what Jesus is calling us to. to do this inner work. And then if people really get transformed inside, you don't really have to worry about them doing outside work, because they can't stand not to.
Yeah.
When you change, when you see differently, you are then compelled to act differently. And what I think you can do as pastor is be careful to be there to help people move to that next step when they're ready to move to it. Because if you get a half a dozen people in your congregation that wake up to some of these things we've been talking about, they're not going to keep on wanting to be the same.
That's really helpful. Thank you. This next pastor says, can you talk more about the energy system that is created within when we come to the realization that we are all people who are created equal?
Yeah, I've really been trying to think about what the nature of reality is. I kidded myself about that I was going to study quantum physics and try to understand what that had to do with reality. And then I read a little bit and thought, no, I'm not going to do that, because I don't have time to try to understand all of that stuff. So what it has boiled down to for me is that there's psychic energy system that's sort of like a big master computer, and there's all kinds of possibilities there, and people can tap into that system however they choose to. And that when we make a commitment to be a resistor, that then we set free some energy that comes that helps us to do that. And every time we stand against negativity, every time we stand against people trying to relegate somebody to the margin, the energy grows a little bit. It grows for us, and it grows out in the world. So every time we interrupt, is what I really like to say, we interrupt negativity, interrupt the supremacist notions. Every time we refuse to get into the negative and the scarcity and the violent and all of that, we contribute to strengthening the energy over here that wants to move down a better road and toward healing. And I just feel like that thinking that way is very helpful, and it helps you to also have a greater sense of your agency, because sometimes, you look at the mess in the world and you think, oh, what am I kidding myself? What difference does it make what I do every day? Because it's just like there's this big machine that's just wreaking havoc across the whole world. But if you can stop and think that every time you interrupt negativity, it retards it a little bit, it confuses it, it destabilizes it a little bit. If millions of people are doing that, then eventually those negative wheels will grind to a halt. And I believe that. I believe that from the bottom of my heart, that every time we interrupt, that we have some impact, and it's real important, no matter how little it seems. I get communications from people sometimes that are 80 or 90 years old, living in assisted living places, saying, well, I can't protest, and I don't see many people, and I don't know what I can do. And I said, you think good thoughts. Yeah. You're thinking good thoughts, you're praying prayers, you're being positive, helps to interrupt the power of negative energy in the world. And that makes a difference. And, to think about that is so empowering, and it keeps you from having to feel helpless and hopeless. And it helps you to feel like you're making a contribution, which you are, even though you're not necessarily out doing a lot of outer stuff. And so I think that we've got to be good caretakers of the energy that we've got. And we've got to start being more open to how much there are all these energy systems in the universe, and which ones are we connecting to, and which ones are we supporting, I think is really important. And we don't talk about this kind of stuff a lot, because I don't know why. Maybe we're scared of the mystical. Yeah. Well, a lot of things are mystical and mystery, and we have to be willing to know that we don't know the answer to a lot of stuff, but that just because we don't know the answer doesn't mean it's not true.
Right. Your comment about knowing your own self reminds me of your presiding bishop, Michael Curry's new book. I just bought it and I'm halfway through with it, but he writes in the title of the book is Love is the Way, Holding on to Hope in Troubling Times. Mm-hmm. writes in that book, just read this last night, he was saying that his grandmother reminded him and said to him, Michael, you need to know who you are and whose you are
Mhm.
before you
Mhm.
do business of trying to figure out who somebody else is.
Right, absolutely. And actually, I wanted to invite everybody to go to our website and register for the conversation that I'm having with Bishop Michael on Thursday. If you're able to join us, we would love to have you. And I'm also Bishop Strickland a little more than halfway through his new book, and also his book, The Songs My Grandma Taught Me, or The Songs My Grandma Sang, I think it is. And it's just lovely to see how much his grandmother impacted who he is. And I would just say to the folks on the call that that's one way to start a conversation with folks in your congregation, to get people to start talking about how they got to be who they are. How did you get here? What are the stories? What are the songs? What are the ways of thinking? To start digging into some of that history can become enlivening just for people to be telling their stories, but to make space for that. It's amazing how you can get people to start engaging themselves by just creating spaces for that kind of thing to happen.
Our last question here that we have time for is from another pastor who says, as a white pastor who risked preaching the gospel to be well, our congregation was freed from the racists in our congregation when they left, and God is redeeming us, body, mind, and spirit. Do you have any advice to encourage people to stop making excuses for their friends who think they can be Christian and racist?
Nothing more than keep telling the truth. Keep on standing up, keep on saying there's no place in God's kingdom for racism. And if we're committed to helping the kingdom to come, we pray that all the time in the prayer Jesus taught us. And I just want to encourage people to start saying the stuff they really want to be trying to believe. So if you want to pray for the kingdom to come, then be open to be the tool to help it to come. And if you're trying to be a tool, then you don't get to play with marginalizing people. You don't get to play with denigrating people. You don't get to play with oppressing people. Even in your own head, you don't get to play with it. There's no place in God's kingdom for oppression. No place. And anybody who tries to make up a place, like I hate it when people tell me, when you're talking about poverty and somebody wants to tell you Jesus said the poor you always have with you. He meant you'll have them more than you'll have him. He didn't mean that we had to try to always keep people poor so we could have some poor people around. He just meant he was leaving pretty soon, but the poor were not leaving. And people if you want to try to make that into, well, poor folks are always going to be here, so why bother with poor folks? You're just playing a game that doesn't make sense. Yeah. So get people to really decide if they want to be really serious about this stuff, or do they just want to dance around and play in the sandbox and look like they like sand, or do they really want to be in the sandbox because they want to be in the sandbox, and want to really get into what that's all about? And to be honest, because there is no room in God's kingdom for second-class citizenship or oppression. And I know that from the bottom of my heart. So every time I'm tempted to want to relegate somebody to second-classness, I know I've stepped out of what God would like. I wrote a book called Living into God's Dream, Dismantling Racism in America, that I would recommend as a study guide, if a book you could read as a book study, I'm trying to say. But God's dream for us is that we should be free people. It was not God's intention for people to be slaves. We figured that out. Human beings did that. And it's against God. It's not about God's love. So every time I'm tempted to want to enslave somebody in my head, I've got to say, help me, Lord, because I know I'm not thinking the way you want me to think. So yeah.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Dr. Meeks. I know we're almost to the end of our hour, but wanted to see if you had any closing comments you'd like to make.
Well, if I can put my hands on this, just a second, because I love John O'Donohue and I love David White. And some of you who've heard me speak maybe have heard, if you've heard me speak before, you know how much I love these folks because I'm always talking about them. I want to read this John O'Donohue poem as an ending. And you notice today that I've been doing poetry, first Antonio Machado and now John O'Donohue, because I think poetry just helps us so much, and that we could do well to reconnect to the poet more as we try to figure out our way to heal it. This is called For Courage. And my poet friend, David White, talks about being a half a shade braver. And I think that being a half a shade braver means that you don't have to have all the courage today that you need for next week. You just got to have a little more than you had yesterday. And then when you get to by the time you get to next week, God will have given you what you need for next week, but you don't have it today. So just want to read this as a closing thing. When the light around you lessens and your thoughts darken until your body feels fear turn cold as a stone inside, when you find yourself bereft of any belief in yourself and all you know unknowingly leaned on has fallen, when one voice commands your whole heart and it is raven dark, steady yourself and see that it is your own thinking that darkens your world. Search and you will find a diamond thought of light. Know that you are not alone and that this darkness has purpose. Gradually, it will school your eyes to find the one gift your life requires, hidden within this night corner. Invoke the learning of every suffering you have suffered. Close your eyes, gather all the kindling about your heart to create one spark. That is all you need to nourish the flame that will cleanse the dark of its weight of festered fear. A new confidence will come alive to urge you toward higher ground, where your imagination will learn to engage difficulty as its most rewarding threshold. And it's from John O'Donohue's book, To Bless the Space Between Us. And I recommend the whole book to you. It's lovely. He's such a lovely soul. Oh, you got it. Yes, yes, yes. He's such a lovely soul. I'm sorry he left so soon, because I'm sure he would have had a lot more to say. But I'm delighted to have been with you today. And I'm going to be with a different group, I guess, on the 26th of October. So it's very good to be with you. And I wish you every blessing as you go forward and trying to be careful, to be faithful and courageous, and do take care of yourselves in this time of COVID. Don't forget to play. Don't forget not to take yourself too seriously.
And Dr. Meeks, I want to end us with, not everyone can say thank you on here, but they're writing it in the chat box. You can see, but on all of their behalves, just thank you for a powerful 2 hours. And you asked a question at the very beginning that I think it's worth us pondering and pondering and pondering and then putting into practice. What am I willing to give up in order to be well? What am I as a person? What are we as pastors and deacons in the church? What are our congregations willing to give up in order to be well? Mm-hmm. And sometimes that pool of Bethesda, we need to get in the pool.
That's right.
Help people out. So I'm just really grateful for your words. I know everyone else is as well. But may God bless your ministry. For that is what.
Thank you.
For us, and may God bless you. And know that this work we do it together, and we're thankful for you.
Thank you so much, and blessings to you. And I'll see you in a couple weeks.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.